last minute tech issues.
Not a problem. I'm sorry for my delay, actually. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. If you could have a quick webcam check for you as well, just to ensure everything's working on the tech end. Start with today's event then. Hi, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. I'm Pranay, volunteer counselor at SFLC.in, and welcome to our session today on governing digital public infrastructure. This week involved various members of our team initiating conversations with experts coming from a range of professional and regional experiences. I hope it has been a fruitful learning experience for you all, and that today's session will be the perfect bookend to this week-long event. Now, before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I would like you all to view this session not as an endpoint for these conversations, but more like a jumping off or a stepping off point. Given the extensive nature of the discourse on this topic and the vast number of stakeholders involved, what has been discussed and what we will be discussing today cannot be fully encapsulated and is not limited to, given the extensive nature of the national, regional, and global dialogue on DPIs. Now, everyone who has chosen to stay with us till this point must have observed that we have tried to approach the topic of DPIs from different perspectives and angles. But one of the major through lines that I was able to take away was that DPIs across different parts of the world will need an adequate, robust, and a rights respecting framework to ensure that people who are meant to be benefited from this infrastructure are truly able to make use of it in the best possible way that is sustainable, inclusive, transparent, and accessible. Now, to help us do that, to help us understand how this can happen, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you all to our panelists for this session today. Firstly, we have with us Ms. Yasodara Córdova, an independent researcher who designs and advises on governance infrastructures that embed privacy, transparency, and accountability into digital systems. Her work bridges privacy engineering and institutional governance, helping organizations implement privacy by design at scale. With global experience, she supports governments and companies in building resilient, rights-based frameworks for data and identity. Secondly, we have with us Soujanya Sridharan, Senior Manager at Aapti Institute. She's a graduate of development from Azim Premji University. Her interest in tech policy stems from her thesis research on labor unions within India's IT sector. Previously, she has interned with organizations such as the Hindu and Tara Trust. This was followed by a stint with IT for Change, where she was involved in the gender and technology vertical. At Aapti, her research involves forging human-centric pathways to labor and infrastructure governance. Thirdly, we are joined by Disha Verma, Program Manager APAC at Tech Global Institute. She's a technology and human rights researcher with roots in rights-based advocacy, apologies, across themes of community health, access to medicine, e-surveillance, data privacy, and rights digitalization. She currently leads Asia programs at Tech Global Institute, mainly looking at digital public infrastructure and labor justice in tech supply chains. Finally, we are joined by Mr. Luca Belli, who is Professor of Digital Governance and Regulation at FGV Law School, Rio de Janeiro, where he directs the Center for Technology and Society and the CyberBRICS project. He is also editor of the International Data Privacy Law Journal, published by Oxford University Press, and director of the Computers Privacy and Data Protection Conference Latin America. Since 2024, he has been appointed as a member of the Brazilian presidency's National Cybersecurity Committee and is also board member of the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership and member of the steering committee of the Forum for Information and Democracy. A very warm welcome to you all, and I'm glad that you all have chosen to be the panelists for this session today. Now, I invite you to provide your opening remarks by briefly addressing how DPI frameworks have shaped up from your experience of working in this space. Ms. Cordova, would be great to hear from you first. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Um, First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. And I think I have been working with DPI since it was not DPI yet. I've been working with generally implementing digital uh, infrastructure into the governance backbone of the governments around the world. And what I see is that when you have to to transform a process from a process that demands physical presence, for example, say you have population in a line waiting to receive benefits, and you want to streamline this process and then adapt it to the digital governance. One of the key features you have is the digital identity, so which is a big focus of DPIs. And India and Brazil are great examples of this. And as the pioneers of implementing digital infrastructure for the governance of identities, we suffer the pains of being the pioneers as well. So we have been we have seen a lot of externalities, negative externalities, as identity fraud, a flourishing market for fraud, and now with the deepfakes, the situation tends to become a bit more complex. And so with this, I'd say that the next steps in DPIs for the countries that pioneered the digital infrastructure into the backbone of their governance is to focus on cybersecurity, not just as a military issue, but as a civil matter. Cybersecurity as fraud prevention, cybersecurity as a reinforcement in privacy with technology, not just with regulations, which I call this the next step of privacy implementation. So you really have to uh, create features from the principles of privacy and cybersecurity. I think that's my introduction. And nowadays, my focus is totally in bringing the conversation on DPIs entirely to the cybersecurity and privacy engineering controls present in the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cordova. Thank you for your opening remarks. Professor Luca, it would be great if you could give us your opening thoughts on this next.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation again. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And so, DPI is actually in the kind of research we do here at the center and in one of our flagship projects called Cyber Bricks, where we analyze and compare the digital policies of the BRICS. So, the DPI entered in our research in two ways. On the one hand, by analyzing how BRICS countries are shaping their digital transformation strategies, and on the other hand, analyzing how BRICS countries are constructing their digital sovereignty narratives and strategies. And DPIs may be what I call good digital sovereignty. So, an example of this good digital sovereignty where technology is understood, developed, and regulated in a way that fosters innovation, empowers people, and also fosters competition. And why am I saying that? Because if you see a very good example that I have discussed in a paper for the T20 when India organized it 2 years ago, 3 years ago actually, about how DPIs can be seen as vectors of good digital sovereignty when they are well implemented. You see that, for instance, the UPI in India or PIX, which is our UPI in Brazil, they are a very good way, a very good example of an initiative that is orchestrated by the public sector to some extent in India with different flavors, and that is used then to reclaim autonomy from a system that previously was completely driven by foreign companies and benefiting primarily foreign companies. So to give you an example, in Brazil, before PIX, Brazilians were totally dependent on Visa and MasterCard to US tech companies that not only charge 3 to 5% per every transaction, which is something that has been completely reverted into the pockets of Brazilians, but also they consolidate data and extract enormous value out of the data that is consolidated and the innovation that is produced, which is not even taxed properly. So the fact, the creation of DPIs to revert this digital colonialism process is something that could be extremely powerful. Now, the problem is to do it in a way that is sustainable. And also in another paper for the T20 last year, we explored what could be some consumer-centered way of creating DPIs, investing in some key principles that emerge as driving force, like data protection and informational self-determination, meaning having the user understanding how data are collected by whom and with whom are shared. This in turn fosters transparency and accountability. And of course, this contributes, as Yasu was mentioning, to the development of a cybersecurity, of understanding the risks and mitigating them, which is also a key principle. And then just to finalize, two other principles that we find extremely important. One is non-discrimination, which of course there are new types of discrimination that can happen when we digitize everything without having in mind that there are populations with different characteristics that will be the recipients of these products. And the other one is meaningful connectivity, which is extremely important, and is, I think, one of the main ingredients of success of India, that prohibited zero rating in 2016. To some extent, this has created some sort of problems in Brazil, because the users of PIX now have reached the maximum capacity, which is 75%, which is the connected population. We still do not have users of PIX of this 25% of the population. This is why the Brazilian Central Bank is creating a version that functions without relying on connectivity. So thinking also about the importance of meaningful connectivity as a building block and the key principle is also something that we have to integrate in our experience.
Right, thank you. And we will be definitely discussing how sort of how the Indian experience and the Brazilian experience has been with respect to the DPI implementation, and how it's had impacts on the governance aspect of it. But yes, thank you for that. Now I'd like to move on to Disha for her opening remarks on this topic. Over to you, Disha.
Thanks so much, Pranay, and I'm very excited to be among just a stellar panel. Looking forward to learning so much today. Just in terms of what DPI has become in front of our eyes, I think, as Professor, I think Córdova said that it used to be called something else. It used to be called multiple other things. Back in the day, it used to be called India Stack. Back in the day, even before that, it used to be called just the singular projects that they are now. But having seen that, I think the one question that I've grappled with in five years of sort of working in the space is what efficiency means to different actors, and efficiency being like a driving factor behind DPI proliferation needs to be studied more closely, because for states building interoperable systems that make faster payments, faster G2P payments, for instance, or that enable the creation of health IDs, for instance, very quickly, is a metric of efficiency. But for a citizen, efficiency lies in how fast they're able to receive those payments, or how easily and seamlessly they're able to receive the treatment, right? So understanding efficiency metrics, redefining efficiency metrics from a community and a citizen lens is something that is my hope for the very near future. And just multiple brilliant research and policy making is already happening in this space. From the Indian experience, as opposed to, I think, many other countries that are now adopting DPIs, is that here DPIs are highly politicized, which can take several forms. They have techno-nationalist flavor, to say the least, to them, which means that contrarian thought or or research that questions DPI, or people that speak up against the concept of DPI or question them in public, are often stifled or censored in overt or covert ways. We've seen this with multiple grassroots movements happening in India. So that's a concern that is difficult to grapple with, because governance and policy tools should be built on a level of consensus even within community, and we don't have that on surface because that research is not coming out. And I think it's also taking the form of an arms race, and sort of a thing that India wants to be proud of and be a leader in, taking from the techno-nationalist flavor that it carries, which has made it difficult to honestly talk about. And conversations like these are honest spaces where we can sit and actually talk about some of these things. They may not be happening at government rooms, for instance. One thing that I hope to take away from this conversation, this panel specifically, is when we talk about governance, and there's a lot of DPI governance and policy making already happening and been happening at international, regional levels. I'm interested in understanding why, at some level, there is still a very heavy use of European language when we talk about a tool that is essentially made for socioeconomic progress and development for LMICs in Global South, right? There is still very little participation of communities. There is little articulation of community harms, like how DPI structures can influence, electoral politics at very grassroots levels in local, hyperlocal contexts, or they can skew power dynamics in hyperlocal contexts. What surveillance and targeted profiling might mean for certain vulnerable groups and communities that can be enabled through DPIs, or and even if we accept the fact that DPI is the key to digital transformation and achieving SDG goals, how do we as citizens actually participate in that without having a free and open internet, in the face of just over 300 internet shutdowns only last year across the world in 54 countries, in the face of erosion of privacy tools like VPNs or encryption? How do we as citizens get to even meaningfully participate in this just this moment of time in tech policy, right? So those are my hopes and reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Disha. Now over to you, Soujanya, if you could speak from your experience, and Aapti, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Pranay and Disha and Professor Luca and Yasodara. It's lovely being a part of today's conversation. And just by way of introductions, I am Soujanya, and I lead a lot of our governance research into infrastructure and labor, and that is precisely what my opening remarks will be touching on. Right, a lot of India's approach to building DPI is distinct from the different DPI systems that we see and interact with in our lives today. And by we, I mean the 20% of the population that uses UPI, about the 90% of the population that has Aadhaar, and the fewer still that are learning about ONDC, right? And all of these innovations are very different in how they're built, how they were rolled out, and how they continue to be consumed. And all of them are the product of certain deliberate governance decisions that preceded them, and sometimes, unfortunately, followed in the aftermath of their rollout, right? So an interesting example to consider, particularly because India, as Disha and Professor Luca just mentioned, is at the forefront of evangelizing DPI systems around the world. It has become a lever of soft power, nationalism, and so on. You see that manifest in the continuance of a DPI agenda that began with the Indian G20 presidency, got reproduced in a certain fashion in the Brazilian presidency, and more recently, South Africa, which was quite silent on DPI, has now made it a very big part of its digitalization roadmap that was released 2 months ago. So it remains to be seen if the US will take it up as a part of its next presidency, but it's very much the baton that is being passed around among a lot of developing countries, right? And and UPI is one of those examples that is quoted as something to be watched out for. And for what it's worth, it is an useful innovation. It has improved mobility of certain classes of population. It has changed how we access and use credit and so on. But it's also innovation that was made possible on the backs of certain progressive policy making in India's financial and banking sector that started as early as 2010, a solid half a decade or more before UPI as we know it was rolled out, right? The RBI had something called no frills accounts that made it easier for a country with a large unbanked population to start thinking about even approaching institutional infrastructure for any sort of financial services. Similarly, ONDC builds off of the experience of several MSME, small players, and other extension services that created digital market opportunities for others who didn't have it. Aadhaar, on the other hand, was built in-house by the government, by volunteers, while UPI, on the other hand, was built in a sort of partnership format and so on, right? So these are just these hold important insights, not just on how do you design policy, but also how do you design ecosystems around how DPI is built, right? At what point do you start involving communities and in what form or fashion? And what are the protections that need to stay in place? We are all very well aware, as Yasodara also mentioned, fraud through and on UPI is an increasingly worrying phenomenon. So what should there have been some forecasting, some sort of anticipatory policy making there? Absolutely. Should we think a little bit more critically about data protection in the context of UPI data? 100%. But all of this will only be possible if we do engage in some considered, even dry-eyed impact assessment of these systems, which lo and behold, unfortunately, doesn't exist. We do have data that comes out of NPCI, we do have data that comes out of UIDAI, but none of these are disaggregated in formats or in fashion that can be used or reproduced for research. The closest we get to understanding UPI usage data is through PhonePay's Explore tool, right? So for us to even think about the next iterations of UPI, like when we did UPI 123, because it took us 5 years to realize that, hey, there are parts of the population that don't have the internet but want to use digital payment platforms. Maybe if we'd made data about such things a little bit more accessible, we'd have more swift, efficient innovation around DPI systems in ways that are also sustainable to export to other developing contexts. This is my opening remarks. I'd also just wanted to make another cheap plug for a tool that my team and I built when we were researching models of DPI governance. And we borrow from 10 different DPI systems around the world, majority, of course, Indian, but also everything from X-Road to PhilSys and beyond, to inform what does a model of multi-stakeholder governance of this infrastructure looks like. I'm just going to plug the tool here. If anybody is interested, it is pretty to look at, so please go ahead and explore. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Soujanya. And yes, everyone in attendance, please feel free to look at the personal chat, the public chat, and yes, uh, yeah, great. Yeah, so I mean, I would like to begin the discussion with, and I think all of your opening remarks are a great segue into the first question, which is, I mean, taking India as an example, and I will definitely come to Professor Luca and Ms. Córdova on their perspective on this. But yeah, taking India as an example, I think the technological infrastructure was built and implemented well before the establishment of governance frameworks. If we take the Aadhaar Act, if we take the fundamental right to privacy, the timing of it when it was established in India, and the data protection law, which is yet to be enforced. So how does, and I sort of see if you envision it sort of like a reverse engineering of how a governance framework, how it's shaped up from how the technology is shaped up, and how does it impact people when the development and implementation of such technology precedes the development of governing mechanisms? Disha, your thoughts on this first.
Um, I have many thoughts on this, but I will curtail to saying that yes, there is retrofitting, yes, there is reverse engineering happening here. I also think there is no forward-thinking engineering happening. There are DPI systems in place, and they've been active for a while that don't have any policy backing to them, and have huge surveillance concerns currently unfolding in India in the absence of an active data protection law. These are concerns we've all discussed at multiple fora among ourselves. I think it's a little comical as well. It's not just, of course, there's a lot of nuance, and we will discuss all of the nuance of like understanding what takes the form of DPI and possibly labeling back in time that, oh, this can be that project, and then maybe we can enhance an older project to make it resemble more like DPI, make it more interoperable, etc. So there is an argument for that, but the comical element of this is that because it is a bit of an arms race now, and has been for India at least, there are government and our premiers and our ministers talk about DPI. It's a lot about how many can we make and how fast. So there's something called the GDI, the Global Repository on DPI, which is very popularly known. If you look at that list, and if you look at, say, the Ministry of IT's Twitter, they've called over 100 different projects DPI on their Twitter, but the Global Repository doesn't reflect as many. So now then I'm wondering, in the absence of a unified language and a definition for DPI, is it okay for our governments to be calling anything and everything DPI? What does calling something DPI entail? Because those accountability metrics are missing currently, at least in our local context. When you say something is DPI, what does that entail? It must come with a very high and very long list of guardrails and safeguards and accountability and transparency and governance standards and grievance redress mechanisms, but it doesn't. And which is why there is just a very sort of easy way of saying that we have over 100 DPIs. Right. So this is one part of it, and the other, of course, is that I worry, at least in the Indian context, DPIs inherently are extremely data maximalist. In that context, they also, in India, where there are so many intersections and so many vulnerable contexts and groups that require, welfare benefits from the state, there emerges an atmosphere of surveillance, and there emerges opportunities for profiling attached to these DPI systems, for which there is no overarching surveillance regime. There is no data protection regime that can really save that. One or two examples that come to mind is APAC and the Potion Tracker. One is on GDPIR, one is just on Twitter called the DPI. Both of these capture behavioral mental health data of kids, of students, as well as now they're trying to also capture health, mental and physical disability data in kids. None of this is regulated to the extent that we would like it to, right? And APAC doesn't even have a policy document backing it up. So these are some concerns that arise. Of course, retrofitting is a problem, but also we're not really making laws for the DPIs that are coming out of India right now.
Right, thank you, Disha. Soujanya, would you like to add to it? Disha has just said.
Sure. No, so I want to pick up on one point that not just Disha has rightly pointed out, right? Like a lot of these are being rolled out with the app in the absence of coherent, policy to govern them, but also importantly, a lot of them have also been rolled out without coordination across policy systems, right? Like, and to me, that's a far more important conversation to be speaking about, simply because in evangelizing DPI, we risk ignoring that you need governance innovation to go hand in hand with technology innovation. DPI technology as it exists is purported to follow certain principles of interoperability, openness, and so on. And they're all valuable in and of itself. Interoperability has both efficiency gains, effectiveness gains, but policy interoperability, to put it simply, is equally important, right? Like, we took a solid 10 years to update, say, our guidelines around PDS distribution long after, say, an biometric ID system was rolled out. And a lot of that needs to go hand in hand. It took a while for something like the One Nation, One Ration Card program to come in place. So thinking about what are the layers in which infrastructure systems are going to be plugged into, and what would be equivalent policy changes that need to be done, is important. And to that extent, definitely agree that we do need a data protection regime in place, but I hesitate to, think that that is somehow the panacea for all of our DPI problems, because it is not. It is scarcely the bare minimum. GDPR hasn't undone data monopolies. The best legacy GDPR has left us is a culture of cookie notices, which all of us find incredibly clunky to engage with. If anything, we need to go back to our debates in 2018 and 2019, where we were thinking critically about things like non-personal data governance, right? And that is ever so, all we have so far as that is concerned is not one but two reports from the Sri Krishna committee, so to speak. I mean, not Sri Krishna committee, Chris Gopalakrishnan committee, apologies. But we need to revisit some of those conversations, particularly because, as Professor Luca Belli mentioned, or as Yasodara mentioned, from a sustainability point of view of these systems, right? Both from a technical artifice point of view, but also extending it to unbanked as well as unnetworked populations, having a secure system that is backed by progressive data governance legislation, more than just data protection, is critical, because DPI does produce a wealth of data. But where is this data going? And who is using it? Can it inform critical policy measures about the future of not just DPI, but also the future of welfare, of finance sector regulation, and so on, are important implications that have to be considered. And I think India is ripe for such a conversation, right? We do benefit from having had these systems for a decade, some of them more than a decade, and I'd like to see the resurgence of those conversations as well.
Thank you, Soujanya. Now, I'd like to come to Professor Luca, and yes, like what has been the experience in Brazil with respect to the technology and how the governance frameworks have shaped up with respect to the timing of it, and how that has interplayed with each other. So, yeah.
Yeah, just a very three quick comments on this. On actually how it played out in Brazil, especially the experience of PICs, and how this can be studied as an example of success and why for other countries. So first, I think that's something that we see at play here, and I think is a secret ingredient for the success of DPIs, is having a multi-stakeholder approach, not in the classic sense of having a nice dialogue with a lot of stakeholders that agree on principles, but in the sense of having different types of stakeholders cooperating to build something, which is what the Brazilian Central Bank has sort of orchestrated. First, having a consultation with both academics and banks, financial intermediaries, to understand how to build the PICs, and also to study foreign experiences like the UPI, that was obviously very inspirational for Brazil, but also to implement it then, because the Brazilian Central Bank has designed it somehow, but it's implemented by the financial intermediaries that keep on participating in what is called the PICs Forum, which is a sort of multi-stakeholder forum where those who implement PICs keep on sharing experiences, problems they might have, or innovation they may create out of it, which is extremely interesting, I think, as a strategy. Now, also what has been also another secret of success for the Brazilian experience, actually two of them. Well, one is sort of policy coherence. And this, I would like to expand on what the previous speakers also has mentioned. I think that the important thing here is not simply to have data protection or competition law, but having institutions that understand it and are able to implement it. Because if you have data protection and a nice data protection authority, and you may say, hooray, we are like Europe, it's simply useless if the institution is not able to implement it. It's not having the law that makes a difference, it's the implementation. And here is very interesting to see how the Brazilian central bank has leveraged the policy that already existed to make sure that PIX would have been a success. Let me give you a very concrete example. When during the pandemic, PIX was going to be introduced, WhatsApp payment was also going to be introduced, and WhatsApp tried to introduce WhatsApp payment 3 months before PIX. If this had been done, we would not be speaking here today about PIX. Everyone in Brazil would have WhatsApp payment because WhatsApp is zero rated in Brazil. Now, the Brazilian central bank has suspended the entry in force of WhatsApp payment until 3 months after the entry of PIX. Why? For competition reason, for consumer protection reason, and really importantly here also for data protection reasons. Because the Brazilian central bank understood very well the policy environment, but also the technological environment. They knew very well what the Indian did. And actually, I think that when the telecoms regulator of India banned zero rating, was not necessarily for great love of freedom of expression, but because they understood very well that without meaningful connectivity, India would have not experienced the transformational period it has experienced over the past decade. So the Brazilian central bank understood this and had the capacity as a regulator to say, I suspend you WhatsApp payment until our initiative, our public initiative enters in force. So what can we learn from this experience? First, that multi-stakeholder cooperation is essential for implementation. I would say more than for nice debates, but especially for implementation. Secondly, if we do not have policy coherence and a regulator able to understand them and implement them, we are doomed to fail. And third, well, it is very rare to have this kind of situation, because even in Brazil, it is very rare to have an institution that is very independent, very well resourced, understands well the policies, and is able to implement it. So the PIX example of Brazil is a case of great success. It allows us to understand what are the ingredients of success, but also to understand that those ingredients are extremely rare in Brazil itself and elsewhere. So I think that this is a very telling story to understand what could be done to make it work, to make a DPI that works for the country, but also how hard it is to develop it.
Thank you, Professor Luca. Ms. Córdova, what is your perspective on Soujanya, Disha, and Professor Luca's responses?
I will build on Professor Luca's response on the factor of competitiveness. And I agree that sometimes institutions that regard privacy regulations don't have the capacity to go and really transform privacy regulations into something that's tangible. And this is true also for the competition authorities, because sometimes when you have DPIs, you're not talking about personal data. I'll give you an example. Say you have a DPI for dealing with a biodiversity sector. Then you have researchers willing to access the data within that platforms. You have civil society that might want to access this biodiversity database, and you have the private sector, which is an important actor in the ecosystem. In this case in the case of biodiversity DPIs, because it might bring sustainability to the entire ecosystem. And here I'm talking that governments setting up rules and standards for interoperability and data collection across several sectors, especially if you're talking about biodiversity, which is a crucial sector that will be from that will have their importance grow in the next years. So you might think about new rules to prioritize certain types of companies within the private sector. You might think about the new geopolitical situation when you want to choose the partners that will have access not just to the data itself, but also access to contracts that will be participating in this ecosystem. And we can go back to the PICS example. We have private sector participating in the PICS ecosystem. They are Brazilian companies right now. It could be different. The partners could be chosen among countries, for example. So it's very important to think about the private sector as an important, I would say it's an important component in a DPI, especially because you have to take the new geopolitical settings in account, and the business models that come with the choices you make for the partners of your DPIs. Because certain companies will have business models that prioritize data collection. You have different companies that will prioritize built-in cybersecurity and privacy controls. And these companies will fight over governmental contracts. This is very true in Brazil. We have several companies fighting over governmental contracts, and it's important to think about what is the business models a country wants participating in the ecosystem when you are building a DPI, especially if you have countries with continental dimensions like Brazil, India, Indonesia, and you have to choose and pick up between the business models to drive your technical stack to a more protective environment, to a more open environment, especially if you're talking about the data that is being collected in these ecosystems. I think that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Cordova. Yeah, and I was able to spot this one key point regarding policy integration and policy interface, which sort of brings me to my next question, which is, given that there is transference of DPI models, where they're being exported and replicated from one country to another, what are the key principles that should be driving governance of DPIs to ensure that they are transferable? I would not want to see it as something that's transferable, but something that sort of converges across various social, cultural, economic, and political contexts across the globe. So, Professor Luca, what's your perspective on this?
Just to conclude and actually to also start to wrap up as we go toward the end of this session, I think that there are some key components here that we can highlight as strategic in terms of building DPIs that are engines of good digital sovereignty, as I was mentioning at the very beginning of my remarks. One of them is obviously understanding the national policy context, but also the context, but also the national technology context. And that is very important to understand what are the actors, the stakeholders that you should leverage in order to make a success out of the DPI experiment, right? Now, once you have understood, and again, I think that this also depends, as Yasodara was mentioning very well, of the type of issues, of problems you want to solve, and therefore the types of stakeholders you have to relate to. So if you want to create something like the PICS or UPI, you will have to target, of course, the financial intermediaries, and then you will have to hope that there is a authority, a regulator that has the capacity to orchestrate this, or you should create one. And that is, I think, also something interesting in the Indian experience, the fact that you have created National Payment Corporation of India, which is also an acknowledgement that to some extent bureaucracy has limits. And so you might need to think about something different. You might need to think creatively to be able to create the DPI. Now, I think that the Brazilian experience also demonstrates that to another extent, the creation of an NGO, a foundation, an association or a non-for-profit corporation like the National Payment Corporation of India also has some limits. Because if you want to have, if you are a user of the UPI in India and you want to know to file a freedom to access of information request and know what kind of data is collected about you, which kind of cybersecurity measures are implemented, the National Payment Corporation of India can reply to you, I'm sorry, this is not a public organ. We are not bound to answer to you. Whereas if I do this in Brazil, the Brazilian Central Bank has an obligation to reply to me. And if they don't, I can sue them. So that is actually, I think, a step forward. But again, this is only possible because there is such an institution. And I'm a little bit skeptical that in other sectors, we would have the same type of success, precisely because there is no other institution that has the same kind of stability, which is also a very important point. I mean, something that is usually overlooked is the political stability that is needed to implement, to create and implement and make sure that these kind of projects are sustainable. The Brazilian Central Bank is an independent institution that is therefore stable and not related to governmental changes. Which is also something that to some extent happens with the National Payment Corporation of India. It's a stable institution. There are not such institutions in other sectors in Brazil. There are regulators, but there are no other regulators that have this capacity, which to some extent is also very bizarre for the Brazilian Central Bank, because it's a regulator that also ends up being a provider of a service with the PICs, which is something quite conflicting also from an administrative law perspective. So again, I'm sorry if I'm speaking too much, but I just wanted to introduce, on the one hand, some elements that we need really to understand and look at to make sure that DPI can be a success, but also the complexity of these elements, which are not necessarily ready to go in all sectors, in all countries.
Thank you, Professor Luca. Coming to you, Disha, sort of like Professor Luca sort of hinted at that aspect of filing RTI applications and how that sort of affects the larger governance landscape. So taking off from there, what is your response to what are the key principles of governance? Yeah.
Very, very pointed question, and I'm glad to take it. So, for context, my previous place of work, we used to file a lot of freedom of information or right to information instruments, applications with regards to a lot of digital interventions by the state. And what repeatedly we found with DPI structures, DPIs, I'm going to use in air quotes because I'm not sure what they mean when they say DPI, but what we were met with, like Professor Luca said, is that because this is a synergy most of the time between the public and the private, there will come a time, almost always, where the government will say that this is actually controlled by the private entity and they won't come under the purview of the RTI Act. And when we go to the private entity, obviously we can't file an RTI, but we can question them, we can write to them, we can ask for accountability. They will say that we're not at liberty to reveal because we're under contract with the government. So there is a mutual sort of enabling of just hiding information that we've seen before, and it's very difficult to get procurement documents, it's very difficult to get technology transfer details. So when you, of course, like within the context of a country, say India, you're not able to have any transparency with your own government. it's a little difficult to expect transparency in transferring technologies overseas. And which brings me to your original question: is that what should be the the key principles for that? I think there is an academic answer here, which is encapsulated in many policy documents. I think specifically the UNDP, DPI, UNDP, DPI safeguards. Yeah. So there is, of course, a need to do needs assessments of communities or countries that you're trying to penetrate for DPIs. There's social audits available. There is cybersecurity preparedness that is absolutely essential in this day and age. But having said that, and having listed all those key principles and tools at our disposal, we must also understand that DPI concerns countries with very little trust among ourselves. The three key players sort of implicated in a DPI is the government, the citizen, and private players. We don't trust each other in India and in other countries in the global south as well. And what that means is there's never going to be a situation where everyone comes and says, yes, this is the DPI structure that works for us. However, that must not mean that you don't talk to people. We must learn from experiences of communities that have experienced a DPI or other similar project like Aadhaar. I think there are just several inspiring, incredible movements in India and in other countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, about digital identity or biometric projects that will tell you exactly what they need. That will tell you exactly their experiences with digital transformation and digitalization and what to do and what not to do. They're just not given the fora to present and ingrain those ideas in policy, right? There was an excellent piece in 2017 by Jean Rez called Aadhaar or Else, which highlights how digitalization doesn't really just mean teaching people how to use a phone or accessing the internet. It really disturbs, dynamics in a village or a town. There was an example of a ration system and someone going to avail, say, food grain from a fair price shop, and for the first time being told that I'm not going to do this, I'm not sure what this is, point of sale machine and all your technology. The response from the shopkeeper was, this from higher up, and if you want to please him and if you believe in his politics, please give us your thumbprint and we'll take it from there. And this practice was so rampant and so frequent that it actually increased leakages and corruption within the pipeline, which the DP and the digitalization of it was aiming to solve. So that's one thought to be left, and there's many other factors of how digitalization can mean separate things to separate groups and how that skews existence and politics at hyperlocal context that should be looked at as well. But yeah, the answer of settling on like a set of key principles to take care of has already been done in policy, and I don't know if there are gaps, of course, but I don't know if we today can solve them. But I think the answer always lies in listening to communities who have experienced it before.
Right. Thank you for that, Disha. Soujanya, if there's anything you'd like to add to what Professor Luca and Disha have stated
Um,
on the principles point.
Absolutely. Just want to keep it brief, right? Some of the things that Disha did just outline in terms of like doing some anticipatory needs assessment, thinking about progressive cybersecurity measures, and so on, are also things that you find encoded even in the G20 playbook from 2 years ago, right? And I was part of the team at Aapti that wrote it. What I think I would add to the laundry list of things that countries need to do in the lead up to a DPI, even contemplating DPI, is something I want to borrow from current AI conversations, which is a human rights due diligence, right? And yes, I recognize that due diligence checks come with their own shortcomings and often can be reduced to a click box engagement. But I do see value in so far as an EU AI Act recommending a risk-based approach to thinking about how do you build and develop AI systems, right? And analogous like framing for DPI, particularly as we contemplate even embedding it in small islands and developing nations, right? Who are not going to even be building their tech. You have DPI in a box solutions that like everyone from like non-profit actors to for-profit actors like Google, championing. If you are importing the technology, if you are importing the integrators, as several consultancy firms are offering, right? I think you also need to import very, very strong governance mechanisms, and some of that need to include conversations not just about data protection or non-personal data governance, but also human rights assessments.
Right. Thank you, Soujanya. Ms. Córdova, if you would like to sort of add on to you have definitely done extensive work on governance, infrastructure design. So if you could sort of speak from your experience on what should be the key principles.
Sure. So when we talk about governance design, it's important to really have in mind that we are designing technical systems as well. So data residence is one of the hardest problems to solve in a governance pipeline ever, because you have to isolate data. You have to sometimes tokenize data. And I'm not talking about blockchain, I'm talking about getting data and applying cryptographic protocols in order to protect this data when it's in certain states. You have to transfer this data while tokenized, and this happens in small sectors like card payments, for example, and this experience could be brought to light in terms of when we are talking about DPIs. So you have to build several technical features into the system so it has the proper governance. So we are talking about building technology, and sometimes companies will overlook this type of technology because they think it's just a waste of money, because it doesn't bring revenue. But for governments and systems that are um, lead in which the government is the leader of this implementation, you have to take these systems into account. How are you going to build data residence? So, for example, now we have PICs operating in Colombia, for example. How is the data from people from different countries being isolated and protected according to the jurisdiction? These are very complex systems, but we have to develop them. And once a country has this problem sorted out, it also counts as soft power, because you have to sell the systems to other countries, and you also sell trust within, especially when you have a government leading a system. So when you want to develop a system that is connected to the governance of these DPIs, you have to take into account the modularity and the interoperability. So this is super important, because modularity will bring the velocity, will change the pace in which you develop the systems. So you get to test the governance rules you set up. And I know when you're talking about regulation, some people will say, I don't want to test regulation because regulation is hard to develop, it's hard to agree on. But if you have an agency that takes care of that regulation, you, like the central bank in Brazil, which Professor Luca stated very well, you have a system that will prioritize the delivery of the service in a human rights and a safeguards, observing the safeguards. So I think there's no way you will be able to develop a system setting up the regulations separately from the technical considerations. You have to get these people, put them in a room, and talk to them about. We are talking about interoperability, what this means in terms of a technical stack. We are talking about observing the jurisdictions in terms of data collection, what this means in terms of technological features. We are talking about data deletion, differences in terms of expiration and data expurges. What are we going to build? This is very important because once you set up the regulations together with consultation in the most diverse sectors, you have agility to respond to society's demands and the protections demands you have nowadays in terms of DPIs. So this is important. Like talking to the technical people and setting everyone in a room so they can really understand what a certain type of regulation will mean in terms of technology.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Cordova. I can see, Soujanya, that you have your hand up. Is there something you'd like to add?
Just on this point of trust, right? And
Right.
we did do some work on trust about how do women trust platforms, especially platforms like UPI, as well as some of the other everyday platforms that we use, right? But more importantly, two important manifestations, trust has become mainstream within the DPI conversation because a lot of them are trying to even build what you called a trust stack, which is to think about values, pathways, tools that you can encode within existing or upcoming DPI systems to build it. But more importantly, trust needs to have a human face is the other consensus which is emerging rather strongly. And this goes back to research that Aapti did in peak of COVID, right? Like 2020, 2021, where with masks on and so on, we visited communities to think about how do they access urban governance in such extraordinary circumstances. And just like there are online architectures that you need to access your services, there are also equally important but often invisible offline architectures, whether they're your agents, your brokers, and so on. And who are those last mile agents? How do you empower them to deal with policy around DPI, but also, if needed, override them, right? Are important consideration. And again, this is a very old paper that we wrote, but one that we keep coming back to, and one that we reference in a lot of our ongoing work as well, which is offline architectures in urban governance. But a lot of these insights can be applied to DPI, as we know, which is why having something like an Aadhaar Seva Kendra, right, your kiosk where you can update your details in a otherwise scary biometric world is important. It suggests a movement towards direction of thinking about what are the layers of trust or like pathways of trust. And by no means am I saying that is enough, but it is the movement in a promising direction.
Right. Thank you for that, Soujanya. In the interest of time, I have quite a few more questions actually, but in the interest of time, I would rather not capitalize on my creator status, and I'll just go over to one of the questions that we have in the public chat. We have a question from Benson. Says China has tried to set up a national payment systems, though systems such as Alipay currently dominate. Do you expect there are useful lessons to learn from Brazil's experience? Professor Luca, would you like to respond to that, please?
Yeah, I think that so we have mapped this. We have an upcoming study on the digital public infrastructure for payments in the BRICS, and it is interesting that all the BRICS members have tried to promote central bank digital currencies, and all of them they have projects at different levels of maturity. China being the most mature, of course, but when we come to infrastructure, digital public infrastructure like PICs or UPI, China does not really need them because they already have large national tech champions that develop them. So I think that what is interesting about in terms of digital sovereignty, that idea of developing digital public infrastructure is precisely to break monopolies that are orchestrated by foreign actors and are hoovering data and capital from your country and exporting it abroad, typically with very loose standards, both of data protection and cybersecurity, and also in terms of fair taxation, which has become a very a trendy topic lately. Well, there are a lot immense troves of data that are exported by global south countries and processed and leveraged to make value and profit in other jurisdictions. These are all something we are going to discuss a lot next week in our conference CPDP Latam. It's one of the key issues, how also to understand value of data in a different way. Now, here, what is very interesting here is to understand that if you already have national champions that are developing this type of infrastructure, you don't need the government to step in and promote the digital public infrastructure for them to build on, because they are already doing it. So in the case of China, actually China is a very good example of where the government does not need to create digital public infrastructures because they already invested a lot with very well-focused industrial policy to facilitate the creation of public or private digital infrastructure at the national level that is working pretty well. So I think that it's another strategy, which is of course driven by the government, but without calling it digital public infrastructure, calling it digital infrastructure.
Thank you, Professor Luca. Ms. Córdova, would you like to add on to what Professor Luca has stated?
Yes, I completely agree. I think the technical capacity of this private sector sometimes can be way better situated than the technical capacity at the government. And although I think the government has the conditions to lead the technical standards and the regulations in order to have this national champions. So PIX is a great example. We have a central bank that's highly proficient in regulation and technical standards. We have some other examples from other countries where the government sets up standards. And I think some governments do very well in terms of, for example, biometrics data collection. And they have tough rules to data collection and data processing in terms of biometrics collections, data collection. And the companies that work for these companies, they have greater quality than companies that, for example, operate in Brazil, that do not have the standards set. And so the biometrics of people in Brazil could be unprotected or with insufficient protections. So I think sometimes the government has to think in the better strategy. Sometimes it's not building technology, because technology, we know it's expensive, especially if you have a larger population. I know people like to talk about Estonia, but Estonia is a smaller country. So, for example, in Brazil, when you have a DPI, you have to set up a public technology company, and the salaries have to be compelling. Otherwise, you have problems, or be that the lack of capable technical capacity, or be that the corruption among the workers in order to sell data, which is a huge problem in several countries that collect personal data nowadays. And so the government might do a better job in regulating and setting up technical standards and the oversight of the application of these regulations and standards than to build the technology itself.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that, Ms. Córdova. And I can see that, Disha, you have responded to Husan's question in the chat. But I can see that you addressed one side of the coin. Is there another side of the coin that you would like to maybe address?
Be more specific, Pranay. What side of the coin do you want me to?
Yes, yes.
So just to
So with
okay, yeah,
respect to like what would be the optimal route, basically.
okay. No,
Yeah.
this is a good question, right? Because it boils down to whether or not you have practical grievance redress mechanisms available to challenge cases where DPIs go wrong, and DPIs do go wrong, DPIs will go wrong, right? Courts, to just reiterate and just expand on what was being discussed in the chat, will not be optimal in this in context of say India, where the Indian courts are already under a lot of pressure, and most likely you come in with an application it's going to be dismissed in the first day. But there are mechanisms to do this, right? SFLC has done work on UDs Plus, which is again a student and teacher and school oriented massive data project, and then also compounded with APAR ID, which is lawless currently, but also called a DPI. Courts won't work as long as projects are voluntary. There is always an argument to be made that this is available to you to use. It's not the only mechanism for you to gain off your or avail of your benefits or entitlements or welfare coupons or whatever else, which is a highly flawed argument as well, because nothing really is truly voluntary, as we've learned from the Aadhaar experience. And in the lack of physical avenues and infrastructures, people will be pushed down the digital pipeline anyway. So now the question remains, what is the optimal route, right? Yes, we talk about transparency and accountability and grievance redress together as good governance principles very actively, but what does it mean to really have those? Having strengthening and not diluting right to information instruments comes first, because at the heart of this, it's digital public infrastructure. There is a public element to it. No amount of PPP models or hybrid modes should be able to shield you from giving information to the public. Number two, having active feedback loops, right? Audit the entire DPI system, audit it in multiple stages, all of its layers. Do it periodically, take feedback, implement it, do social audits if possible. They're not always the most foolproof method, but involve communities. And have avenues for grievance redress. It can be as little as one website that actually works and isn't riddled with dark patterns where you'll be able to flag a problem. Deal with complaints in a manner that makes sense, and don't there's been experiences with Indian DPIs where complaints received on a health portal are made public on that health portal with information about the complainant and their health ID, and there is zero respect for privacy. So deal with complaints in ethical ways and in expeditious ways. And yeah, adherence to these good governance principles takes you a long way. I think we don't have our basics covered yet, and we need to.
Right, right. Thank you for that, Disha. In the interest of time, we'll have to end today's session. Thank you to all the attendees who have joined us today and participated. Thank you again to our esteemed panelists who chose to take time out of their busy schedules and contribute to the discourse on this very important topic. Finally, I thank the entire SFLC.in team for their passion and heart. We hope to see you all again soon, as SFLC.in will continue to foster such essential conversations on DPIs and beyond in the future. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks
Bye.
so much, Pranay.
Thank
Bye,
you. Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.